The word imagination is in the subtitle of my talk because I think about imagination a lot, sort of obsessively, and I've been thinking about it particularly hard for the last year and a half or so. I started thinking about it particularly hard during the American election campaign because I kept having the same conversation with people. People would say that Donald Trump wasn't going to get the Republican nomination. And then, after he had the Republican nomination, they were saying that he couldn't possibly win the presidency. And when I asked people why they thought this, even when it was clear that he had locked in the Republican nomination, and people would say to me, no, but it's not possible. There's going to be an intervention in the convention. Something is going to happen. And I say, well, why do you think that? And people would say, because I can't imagine him being the Republican nominee. And I think there's a real confusion. I think it's a very human kind of confusion between sort of what we can imagine and what is actually possible. Just because we can't imagine it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And in fact, when we understand that we can't imagine something, that's a moment when we understand our limitations, and not a moment that should make us feel complacent and certain that this thing that we can't imagine isn't going to happen. So I think that's one of the problems with how we think about what might happen to us in the future, and also what's happened to us in the last couple of years. Another problem is that when we talk about democracy and populism, we assume that we know what we're talking about, and that there's this thing that we need to protect or save that we can define, and worse yet, something that has actually been achieved, none of which is, I think, clear or in fact true. But I started, I'm working on a book, and so I've been looking at places and ways of not so much destroying democracies, because as I said, I'm not sure that we can talk about this thing that is being destroyed, but of turning away from democracies, of ending the journey toward democracy, right? Or taking a disturbing detour. And for now, I've written down for myself 7 lessons in imagining the worst. These are the things that we need to imagine that make this detour or this turnoff possible. One is, imagine destroying a sense of participation. It's not very hard to imagine. It's not very hard to imagine people who don't feel that their vote makes a difference in how they live. It's not very hard to imagine people who feel continuously that they have been deprived or cheated or jilted or otherwise treated unfairly by the government. A government that, at least formally, they voted for. What that makes possible is it makes possible for somebody to run against government as such, not a sitting president, not even so much an opponent, but against the way that government has been working, right? That's what we saw in the United States, and I think that's what we see a lot around the world right now. We saw somebody who was running for president while also running against the way that government in America is constituted. And what's really amazing about this, and again, this is something that we see in a lot of places, he has become president, and he continues to campaign against government as such. Right? He deflects a lot of criticism by making the argument about some imaginary they, whether it's the previous president or the Democrats in Congress or the way things are done in Washington, that are wrong with government as it exists, right? And that make him separate from government and also happen to make him completely unaccountable. A second lesson, and this is something that is closely related to the first, is engage in a forever war. Right? That's the state that the United States has been in for the last 16 years. and it has taken several countries along. And the forever war is also a state that's familiar to us from the 20th century and from various empires. But what makes the war that the United States is in, and has been since 9/11, a forever war, is that it's a war against an unidentifiable enemy. It was first called a war on terror, basically a war on an emotion. Then it became a war on terrorism, a war on a tactic. But you can't win that war. There's no end point. There's not going to come a time when there's no more terrorism, right? When the option of terrorism is not available to people. It's not clear when that war ends. In fact, it's a war that can't end. But being in a state of forever war, being in a state of permanent emergency, creates a sense of being under siege, inflates the idea of patriotism and national unity, that makes it very easy to exploit. But it also serves to continuously concentrate power in the executive branch, in the hands of the commander-in-chief. And that in turn made it possible in the United States for somebody basically to run for autocrat, right? That was conceivable because we had been at that point through 15 years of concentrating power. So that office, in the imagination that he was running for, had changed drastically from offices that previous candidates had run for. Lesson number 3 has to do with conspiracy thinking and conspiracy myth-making. It's an incredibly effective way of destroying democracy. We all saw Trump traffic in conspiracies. Trump got his start as his political start as a conspiracist, as somebody who claimed, who was a birther, who claimed that President Obama was not born in the United States. That tapped into another potent conspiracy in the United States, which is the truthers, who are convinced that 9/11 was organized by the United States government, which takes us back to point number 1, right? The idea of running against government. You've all heard about other conspiracies that his supporters have trafficked in, including the imaginary pedophile sex ring run out of the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, D.C. by the Democrats. But what makes this kind of conspiracy myth-making so potent is that it actually calls forward an equal and opposite reaction. So it gets everybody involved in conspiracy theories. And so the opposition to Trump, it has been obsessed now for nearly a year with the Russia conspiracy. Now, this is very complicated to talk about because there may have been a conspiracy, but the possible existence of a conspiracy is no excuse for conspiracy thinking, right? But we have seen American cable television news obsessed with making imaginary connections. And usually they are imaginary connections between various stories and various developments, just to prove that Donald Trump was elected by the Russians. And there's something terrible about that, and it's also something very understandable about it. I mean, we all want Donald Trump to have come from outer space, or at least to have been elected by Russians. And so it's very comforting not to think about Americans electing him. But as long as we don't think about Americans electing him, we don't think about Americans electing him, which happened. The other thing, of course, and this is how conspiracy thinking is so damaging to democracy, is that conspiracy thinking is concerned with things that are hidden, with secrets. Secrets that can only be revealed. They cannot be learned. They are not a fact of our shared reality. They're not facts of public life. They're not right in front of us. Right in front of us, Donald Trump is deregulating every industry under the sun, destroying American healthcare, eviscerating the State Department, turning back civil rights, engaging in absurd and cruel fights with people who disagree with him or who he disagrees with. All of that, all of those attacks on democratic thinking and democratic life are happening in plain view and need our full engagement. But instead, it is much more interesting, much more comfortable to engage with something that's hidden from view. And unfortunately, humans don't have endless bandwidth, and we do make choices about what to engage with. This brings me to lesson number 4, which is discredit the concept of politics. Right? I don't know how this language works in Australia, but I know that in the United States, often you will hear that that the president has lied yet again, and it's just politics. Right? There's this expression, just politics. Or we will hear the word politics used to delineate certain activities that are connected directly to electoral politics, to the mechanics of actually getting somebody elected, right? That's politics. Everything else is not politics, right? Campaign finance is politics. Pandering to donors is politics. What actually is politics is the way that people agree to live together. The rules and understandings that we achieve through the very difficult process of democracy that allow us to inhabit the same society. That's politics. Getting elected and pandering to donors is not, I think, properly called politics. Or it is a very small part of politics. But discrediting politics, and again, it's related to this idea of running against government, is what makes somebody who is explicitly anti-political so successful, right? And one of the things that Trump traffics in is withdrawing from every political agreement that the United States has ever entered into, whether abroad, as in the Paris Accords, or UNESCO, which the United States recently withdrew from, or trade agreements, or internally. You know, the deregulation, the destruction of the healthcare system. Those are all politics. That's actually how Americans have figured out how to live together. And he is fundamentally opposed to that. Lesson number 5, degrade language. Trump is a master of degrading language. He does it in a couple of different ways. These are ways that are very familiar to me from growing up in Russia and from covering Putin for 20 years. He lies, but he lies in very particular ways. He lies to assert power. He lies not to convince you that something is not true, that something that's not true is true. He lies to show that his microphone is big enough that he can say whatever the hell he wants, whenever the hell he wants to, and you can't help but engage with it. There's no way to not pay attention to his tweets. There's no way to not, for me as a journalist, for example, to not cover his lies. Right? He also uses words and phrases to mean their opposite. Again, this is something very familiar to me from growing up in a totalitarian society, where, you know, when people went to the polls in the Soviet Union, it was called the free expression of citizen will. Which was not free, had nothing to do with expression. They weren't citizens, they were subjects, and there was no will involved. Because what you did is you went under fear of penalty to the polls where you had to check off the sole name on the ballot. Donald Trump uses phrases, and it seems innocuous at first. It seems funny when he says that he is the object of a witch hunt. The most powerful man in the world cannot be the object of a witch hunt, right? The witch hunt is something that powerful people perpetrate against people who don't have power. But he uses that kind of language all the time. He uses the word safe space to refer to public space and a public official having the right to not be accountable in a public space, because it should be a safe space. And so he uses that word to mean, that phrase to mean its opposite. But more than that, he uses words to just mean nothing, right? I mean, there are words that we can't use anymore because he's made them mean nothing. You know, words like great, or big, or the best, or president. But he creates word salad. He creates very weird issues for journalists, right? When you're transcribing something that he said, and you don't know where the punctuation marks go, because you actually can't know what it means, because it means nothing. Right? That is a direct assault. I mean, it's funny, right? We're all laughing a little hysterically because it's funny, but it's like really scary because it is actually a direct assault on our ability to live together. If we don't have language to communicate, then we can't have democracy. We can't have agreement about how a society works. Language is the ultimate tool of achieving that. And if that's taken away, if that's just rendered unusable, then we can't do it. Lesson number 6. Reject the concept of history. And this is something that's done in subtle and not so subtle ways, but it's actually, if you think about it for a second, the mind boggles as to how many battles related to history are being fought sort of in the public space in the United States right now. There's the issue of Confederate monuments. And the argument made for the preservation of Confederate monuments is that they are history, so they should just sit there. That's not how history works, right? History is not a thing that sits there. History, if we want to have history and want to preserve history, is a story that we engage with, and there can be different narratives, and they have to be debated. Letting something sit there because it has always been there and it should always be there, is anti-historical. Right? And Trump is waging this battle in history in a variety of different ways. Confederate monuments, the idea that football players need to stand up when the national anthem plays, because it's somehow as though it had always happened. Not actually true. It has only been happening since 2009, when the American Department of Defense started paying the National Football League to have the players stand up during the anthem. The reason the Department of Defense started doing that was to increase the number of people signing up for the military. Remember the Forever War? Point number 2. But most of all, I'm concerned about the way that history is being rejected in the conversation about identity politics. Right? It's like people who have identities just hatched this morning, like we all hatched this morning, and there's no reason why any of us should perceive reality any different from any of the rest of us, and there's no reason why we should be in conversation about it. I mean, that's the sort of what the attack on identity politics, vastly simplified because I have less than a minute left, boils down to. It's a rejection of history. It's a rejection of the fact that people with a certain identity, one that didn't have to be articulated, have had the power for centuries and decades, and people whose identities do have to be articulated haven't had the power. And that's how we got identity politics. But if you forget that history ever existed, if we all hatched this morning, then of course identity politics makes no sense. And that's the only way that the argument against identity politics makes any sense. And that brings me to my last lesson, which is a way to destroy democracies is to forget about the future, right? Which is directly related to history, because if you have no past, you also have no future. But another way in which we forget about the future is when we're concerned only with how to confront Trump right now, how to get rid of Trump, how to get Trump impeached, how maybe to get the electors to unelect him. This thing, the Electoral College that we have in the United States. There was a movement to get the electors to unelect Trump, which, as one political commentator wrote very astutely, would only work if we never planned to have another presidential election ever again. Now there's a movement of psychiatrists who actually marched through the streets of New York the other day, demanding that Trump be removed on the grounds that he's mentally ill. Also a great idea if we're never going to have another president, right? Because the idea that a super governmental body of psychiatrists can remove a president is really kind of frightening and not terribly democratic. And there are also things that I want to say about forgetting the future that have to do with the campaign and the campaign that the Democrats ran, but I understand that we're actually going to have a chance to talk about that on the panel, so I will stop here. Thank you.